Now back to one of our top stories of the day, the sentencing of Keneilwe Pule's murderer, Lungile Nxelelwa. While welcoming the two life sentences, gender activist Lisa Vetten believes that the low conviction rate is still a challenge. Now for more on the story, I'm joined by Lisa Vetten. A very good afternoon to you and thank you for your time today. Your response and your reaction, Lisa, to the two life sentences that were handed down today.
Well, they're entirely appropriate and they're in keeping with the legislation that sets minimum sentences in place of life for cases of rape and murder. So it's good that the law has followed exactly what it's supposed to do, and these are laws that have been in place since 1997. I think it's one thing to celebrate a sentence. It's another thing to talk about how do we make these sentences much more of a deterrent by making it much more likely for far more perpetrators to be convicted. Because when a very low number is convicted, I don't think these sentences really act as a deterrent because most perpetrators, quite correctly, will think they're going to get away with it.
So the sentence now has been handed over. And we saw throughout the handing down of the sentence and even throughout the trial, a rather non-remorseful Nxelelwa. What does this type of attitude speak to? What does it point to? What does it say about the fight against gender-based violence?
Well, I think the one thing that's important to bear in mind is that men murder for different reasons. Some are somewhat more remorseful than others. This particular individual could be showing a lack of remorse because he is covering himself up in bravado and he doesn't want to take responsibility for his actions. And he may not think that what he was doing was very wrong. But I think he belongs to that category who probably sincerely don't believe what they did was wrong and that the woman who they murdered asked for it. And they were entirely justified in their actions. And he may even belong to that certain category of men who are not at all deterred by being arrested or convicted, and who may even go and hand themselves over to the police afterwards after they've killed their partners. And that's because killing their partners is their primary aim in life, and no law anywhere is going to deter them from doing that. So that's a small category of men, but they're very disturbing, and I think they are the most difficult to try and hope we can change.
What do you believe needs to be done in the fight against gender-based violence, considering that we do have a small portion, be that as it may, of men who see nothing wrong with this? How can the fight against GBV be made to be impactful and transformative as far as male behavior is concerned?
I think if we focus on femicide, which offers, I think, particular challenge because murder is very hard to prevent. I think if we look at femicide, we can see very definite patterns which can point to us where we can have an impact. So I think we can immediately start looking at those cases where there's a history of stalking and where the woman is wanting to end the relationship. Those kinds of relationships are high risk, and where those are identified, they should immediately, I think, trigger a particular kind of protective response from the police in order to protect that particular category of women. Then you get men who, I think, had they not been incredibly drunk at the time, they may not have killed their female partners. So I think if we restricted the sale of alcohol, that would at least reduce the likelihood of women's death. Of course, it doesn't solve the problem that those men are still violent and abusive, but it does reduce the likelihood of those women dying. So I think looking at ways of controlling alcohol would be another really important intervention to make. I think also, this is a much more psychological suggestion, but I think it's quite possible to see that in a certain category of men, they have what we would call attachment disorders. There are men who respond very, very badly to women leaving them, which is why I think when a woman tries to end the relationship is such a dangerous time for her. And that, I think, goes to us thinking about in the long term, how do we address the ways in which we bring up boys? How do we look at things like how we can assist parents and children to bond more closely during their early years? How do we address those kinds of problems and pick them up earlier in children in order to prevent them reaching this much more serious stage as adults? So we'd have to look at a range of different kinds of solutions, some of which are immediate and some which we might only see having an impact in the long term.
I'm quite interested, Lisa, in your view regarding this. I mean, we saw with Nxelelwa that he told several people about what it is that he intended to do, how he was going to kill his partner. How can the law come in at these earlier stages? Should somebody decide to go and report the planned murder, how seriously do the officials actually take them at that time before anything has actually even happened?
There is not a very good record of the police taking cases seriously. And in fact, I think one of the difficulties we face is that even when women have protection orders and go to the police for help, the police still do not intervene, leading to women's deaths. So I think there is a very serious problem in the police response. But I think if we could alter that, and I think if we could also start thinking more imaginatively around how we do risk assessments. Because as I mentioned previously, there are some cases that are clearly very high risk. And anybody who has told others, this is what I plan to do, and can even tell you how they plan to do it, that you should take very seriously because it shows that they've given thought to that. Those sorts of cases, we should really encourage people to go and inform the police, but make sure that we have trained the police so that when those kinds of responses come, they listen and they take the necessary action. And I think we also have to link that kind of proactive intervention by the police, I think, to providing women with shelter as well. And perhaps also with giving some training to family members and friends around how do you become an effective bystander? How do you intervene when somebody's saying these kinds of things? What can you do and say that's effective, that might make them think? Or who do you go and report to in order to prevent the person from acting on their threats?
That's such an interesting perspective that you bring up, Lisa. When somebody comes to you with an intention to commit murder or to inflict any sort of harm and danger on somebody, in one way or the other, they are somewhat confiding in you. So, what is your possible responsibility at that time? And can you actually even be part of the intervention before it actually even happens on how to change their prospective behavior? But how high is the success rate for those who do try to change behavior for such individuals who are planning to commit these crimes?
Well, I think firstly, you are owed no confidentiality whatsoever if you're telling somebody that you plan to commit a crime. There's no confidentiality there. If, on the other hand, you are a victim and you are revealing the fact that you've been victimized, that's different. There's confidentiality there. But if you've committed a crime, you are owed, or planning to commit one, you're not owed, you have no entitlement whatsoever to confidentiality.
So what should one do, Lisa? So what should one do then, Lisa? Should you go and report the case immediately, or do you try and change their mind, or do you do both?
No, I think it will depend on who you're dealing with. I think I've seen cases like this before, and sometimes it's male friends who've spent enough time with their friend to know that he is dangerous, and that actually they're not going to be able to change his mind, and the best thing they can do is to go and inform the police. I have seen cases where that has happened. But there are others where he might be a different kind of man, where if you remove him, if you take him away somewhere, if you speak to him, if you get his family, other people who are influential in his life to speak to him, that may alter his thinking. But I think what it points to is a real gap in our response to domestic violence in South Africa. There's some very good models that have been tested in the United Kingdom, for example, where they do what are called multi-agency risk assessments, where you have different groupings like social workers, like the police and the courts, meeting together around cases that have been identified as high risk and looking at how they work together in order to protect that woman. It's a real shame that as we are looking at amending the Domestic Violence Act right now in South Africa, that we are not looking at those kinds of responses and thinking about how we could create something similar in South Africa, and how we could then perhaps draw on those who are uncomfortable about what they're hearing and would like to see something happen and know that their friend is very likely to act on their threats. So there's a bit of a missed opportunity here at the moment.
And I must say, for me, Lisa, with that entire case, Nxelelwa's mom comes out as the hero, who actually went out of her way to even report her own son and be part of the investigation and be part of the evidence. How prevalent is this, that family members actually do go to the law and actually participate in the prosecution of their own family member for wrongdoing?
That's a really interesting question. I have no idea how often that happens in relation to where it's a family member of somebody who's committed a crime. And I think for a mother, this must be a very hard thing to do, and she really is to be commended. I think, again, there is probably a real gap in South Africa in terms of trying to help family and friends think about how you intervene, because many see this, but they feel absolutely helpless around what to do. Sometimes they're also fearful if they get involved, are they putting themselves in harm's way as well? So I think there's also another possibility here to look at how do we support and encourage and enable people to get involved when they see that something wrong has happened. And I think when they do take a very difficult step like this, that they are offered support and endorsement by the rest of society, and that they aren't criticized for having not supported their child or having been an informant or any of those other negative labels that we attach to people who try to cooperate with the police.
Lisa, thank you so much for your time, your input and your insight. Very much appreciated this afternoon. Thank you. That's Lisa Vetten.